pleasure to call him up to the stage to introduce Eric Rosenthal.
Thanks, Randall. It's with great pleasure that I introduce Eric Rosenthal. Eric is the CEO and Chief Technology Officer of Creative Technology, a company specializing in imaging, audio, and long-term data storage technologies, who has worked with NASA, NSA, ONR, and NRL. Mr. Rosenthal is currently scientist in residence at the New York University's Tisch School of the Arts. He was formerly Vice President of Walt Disney Imagineering Research and Development, and General Manager of Systems Engineering for the ABC TV network. He received an Emmy for the audio-video systems engineering of ABC Television's coverage of the 1980 Winter Olympics at Lake Placid, New York. Mr. Rosenthal has been awarded 9 patents. He has also designed and developed products for those with hearing loss, including the Emmy award-winning closed captioning system, which you're all very much familiar with, installed in television receivers worldwide. He is currently working with us at MITRE on a patented technology to store data in perpetuality, targeting uses in healthcare and data protection. And I must say, he signed some books for my children, so I really appreciated that. They're big space fans, and they're going to really enjoy that, so thank you, Eric. Please welcome Eric Rosenthal.
Okay, I'm going to talk about a few things, mostly anecdotal, that try to bring together how we're very, very good at disconnecting the various disciplines. And we'll start by talking about some of the things that I work on. It occurred to me after the development of high-definition television and my disappointment at the resulting images that we ended up with high-definition television that we could have done a lot better. Unfortunately, high-definition television is based on a technology and a theory, actually a hypothesis, developed by Thomas Young in 1800, that we have 3 different types of nerves endings in our eye, and each one is sensitive to a different trichromatic primary, red, green, and blue. And unfortunately, 216 years later, that is still not proven. And there is no reason in the world that we should think that the images that we've created using this technology have created images that match what we can see with our own eyes. You're never fooled into believing when you're watching television, when you see an image, when you go to the movies, that any of those images are real. But we're all sitting here and we're compelled into believing that we're all actually here and it's not a fake representation of us. And the reason is that there's information missing from these systems. So red, green, and blue primaries is a system that basically exploits the fact that it allows us to fool ourselves into seeing color images. But we've created systems, at times, remarkable systems. When I say remarkable, I mean that when we invented color photography, and most of you think of color photography being Kodak, but it wasn't invented by Kodak. Color photography was invented by Gabriel Lippmann. He won the Nobel Prize for the invention of color photography in 1908. And what he invented was a system that was not based on red, green, and blue. It was based on full spectrum imaging. You could see every single color, just like in nature. You can't do that with red, green, and blue primaries. So after HDTV got approved by the FCC, 18 different standards, all based on legacy technology that was really introduced 75 years ago, in a remarkable system that actually created color images in a day when we had vacuum tubes. This was very hard to do. But it's a trick. It's a trick into making us believe that we're seeing color images. Not a great match for human vision. So after HDTV got approved and I was disappointed, I was sitting around one day at the Naval Research Lab in Anacostia, and they said, well, if you were going to invent television today, how would you do it? And my answer was immediately, I would go around the world talking to vision scientists trying to understand what they have learned recently about how we see, because this is the receptor of the image that we're trying to capture. And they actually gave me money to do that and to go around the world talking to vision scientists. And what we discovered is that these scientists were working in areas that were very interesting. For instance, I met with Dr. Anya Hurlbert, who was with the University of Newcastle on Tyne. She's an American citizen and went to the UK because she could not do her work here in the US. Her work was based on tetrachromaticity in women. There are certain women that have a hypercolor acuity. They're called tetrachromats because the theory is that they have 4 different types of cones in their retina. The reason she went to the UK is at the age of 5, you are sent to school just like you are in the US. They give you a vision test in school. They log your vision. And in the UK, they log your vision and they log your ancestry. And she needed the database of both the vision and the ancestry to do her work. And she ran a lab funded by the Wellcome Trust in the University of Newcastle. And she studied tetrachromaticity of women and discovered that the women that had tetrachromatic tendencies also had fathers that were colorblind. And eventually, those people died. And they dissected their eyes and discovered that the cones of the father had exactly the same chemistry as the cones of the daughter, and that the only difference was that the cones of the father were all exactly the same size. And the cones of the daughter had a larger size distribution than trichromats, meaning that the size of the cones were varying in size more than a trichromatic person. So they're busy telling me this. There were 17 PhD research scientists there saying they have not found any chemical difference between the cones. All they know is that the size is different, and they don't understand why size matters. Well, I raised my hand and said, I understand why size matters. I'm a radio engineer. Size matters because light are waves, and the color of light are different wavelengths of light. And if you thought about the cones being antennas, radio antennas, that they would be tuned to receive different frequencies of light, different colors of light based on their size. So that got me to thinking, well, could it be that cones are antennas? And the answer to that question is, I don't know. So we basically came back to the US after we also met with Professor Semir Zeki at the University of College of London, and he pointed out, it was very interesting, he's a brain surgeon, and he has a hobby of human perception. And he asks his brain surgery patients, when they're under functional MRI, if they would volunteer 15 minutes of extra MRI time to do perceptual tests for him. He discovered, based on his research, and he's written 7 books on this subject, the various different temporal detection and we'll go into this later on another slide I can show you, that, that shows the sequence of the way that we see things. The interesting thing that I'm bringing this up now is that he sat in an office in London where he sat behind a window that overlooked the BBC tower, radio tower, television tower, and it's got hundreds of antennas on them, and all of them are tapered. And so he doesn't know anything about radio theory, so I explained to him what we talked about at the University of Newcastle. So I explained radio theory to him, and the way I explained it to him is I said, look at those antennas behind your head out that window. They're tapered. And they're sized for the wavelength of the transmission that they are transmitting. The point here is biologists and medical professionals do not understand wave theory. They're not taught wave theory. It's not in the curriculum. But if they did, they'd be able to connect the dots. So they need other people to connect the dots. So I was challenged by Professor Semir Zeki to ask the question, why are cones shaped like cones? The only other organ in the body that is shaped like that's conically shaped is the cochlea. And we kind of know how that works. So I wrote a paper called The Wave Theory of Vision. And the wave theory of vision describes how we see based on completely ignoring the 200-year-old concept of red, green, and blue cones. So, we're trying to explore how it is that we see the images that we see. This sensor is a full spectrum sensor. It's not based on 3 channels of color, red, green, and blue. We see continuously. Oops. There you go. We see continuously that, and we can see colors that cannot be reproduced by red, green, and blue primaries. In fact, those of you who have digital cameras may have noticed that when you're taking pictures of things that are blue, that the blue doesn't actually come out exactly right. Taking pictures of things that are purple, they never come out right. They might come out pink. The reason for that is that certain colors are outside the red, green, and blue color space. So each camera maps colors into spaces that are close to where they should be, but no one knows where they're actually supposed to be, so it's different for every camera. We have 10 to the 10th dynamic range. We can see from starlight to daylight. The cameras that we have can basically are 10 to the 3 or 10 to the 4th at most. Displays recently have become higher dynamic range, but for the most part, displays that you have for your computer are 10 to the 3rd dynamic range. We have better optical performance than any legacy film or electronic system. We have so this is a slide that just shows the dynamic range of our vision system compared to a camera. So in starlight, very low light levels, we use the rods in our eyes. In moonlight and brighter, we use rods and cones. In dusk and dawn, we're still using rods and cones. This is our best color acuity in indoor lighting and diffused sunlight. We use our cones for that. And in bright sunlight, this is actually could possibly cause damage. But this area right here, this area is where TV cameras work. So we're looking at images that can only be captured in this area of light levels. Have you ever seen the setup of a movie being shot out in the field? 90% of the equipment is lighting equipment. 90% of the equipment is fixtures that are filling in dark places or reflectors that are filling in dark places. What they're doing is they're creating the scene such that it fits, the light level fits into this small area so that the camera can work at its best and capture the most information. We don't need that. This happens for us automatically. This is a slide that shows the temporal changes, the temporal sequence that we see things. So the first thing that we perceive is color. And Professor Semir Zeki pointed out that we see color very, very fast, faster than the brain can possibly process color. What that means is that color is determined in the retina before that information ever gets to the brain for further processing. Smell is the next thing we perceive, and he points out that the reason that color and smell are first is because those are the kinds of things we know to stay alive. Those are dangerous things. We then sense form. We then sense sound, depending upon how far away the source is. And then we sense motion. The point here is that we have been so obsessed with, when we capture images, in reducing the data set that we have created expert groups, motion picture experts groups. MPEG stands for Motion Picture Experts Group. JPEG stands for Joint Pictures Experts Group. These are groups that worry about how to take this huge data set that has to be captured in a high-resolution image and reduce it down so that it has the least amount of information in it, but we still perceive it as the same image. The experts in the Joint Pictures Experts Group and the Motion Picture Experts Group invented a system. The first thing that happens is it removes blue. It basically is working on a monochromatic picture. It removes motion and it removes detail. It then inserts blue when you decode it. It inserts blue, inserts motion, and inserts detail, which is exactly opposite of the way our perception system is set up. This is why we see artifacts. I have a friend, his name is Gary Demos, and Gary Demos works on processes for compression systems for the Defense Department, and he developed a system that used layered compression. And layered compression basically looks at an image and says, I'm going to break this up into various layers. One layer might be things moving from left to right. Another layer may be things moving from right to left. Another layer might be things moving up and down. Another layer might be things moving down to up. Another layer might be bright parts of the image. Another layer might be medium brightness parts of the image. Another layer low light parts of the image. He was able to create compression for images that were 300-to-1 compression, and you could not tell the difference between that and the original. When you're dealing with MPEG and JPEG, if you do 20-to-1 compression, the image is almost not usable. So Gary Demos was doing something that was a better match to human vision. At the time he developed this, a serendipitous thing happened. I visited Professor Frank Werblin at Berkeley. And Professor Werblin was an electrical engineer and was like a resident researcher for a biologist at Berkeley who was trying to study vision in a rabbit's retina. he needed microprobes. So Professor Werblin worked on microprobes for decades. And these are microprobes that actually attach to the 12 membrane layers of a rabbit's retina. Rabbit's retina is a strip. So it has an ending that we can actually connect to. Doesn't have a USB connector on it, but it's... So he developed these microprobes, and he connected those microprobes, those 12 layers, to log the levels, the electrical signals coming off of those membrane layers. And what he discovered was one membrane layer only had signals when an image moved from right to left. Another membrane layer when an image moved from left to right. Another one up and down. Another one down and up. You get the idea. What he discovered in a rabbit's retina was exactly the same process that Gary Demos did, and the two of them didn't know each other. So RGB, red, green, and blue, is a form of very lossy compression. Once you have limited your color space to red, green, and blue by capturing an image with a film camera or a digital camera, you have reduced the color space so that you are eliminating colors that we can see. So it's a form of compression, and it's lossy, meaning that once you've done that, you can't get those colors back. We're capable of seeing luminescence. We're capable of seeing textures. If you took a picture with a digital camera of this room, you would not be able to see the textures of the chairs. But we can see that, and we take it for granted that we can see it. We also have some strange ability in our vision system to take combinations of wavelengths, like red and green, and perceive not red and green, but perceive yellow. That's some mechanism that's going on, and we try to emulate that mechanism electronically, and very often we get it wrong. One of the ways a camera works is that it tries to correct the balance of color by mixing every pixel together, mixing the colors of every pixel together, and by the theory being that if you mixed all the pixels together, whatever color that ended up with, which is going to be gray in a normal scene, that would be the equivalent of gray, which is white, but a lower luminance level. And that's what they set the scene white balance to for that scene. Picture what would happen is if you were to take a picture in a room where basically it had pink walls and a pink carpet and a red ceiling and red tablecloths, and now you took a picture in that room and the camera mixed all those pixels together, you think you'd get gray? You wouldn't get gray, you'd get pink. That's what the camera would use as white balance, so it would get the white balance wrong. Professional photographers always use a gray card. They always use a white standard reference to help the camera not make that mistake. I'm sure you don't do that when you're taking pictures with your cameras. You take whatever you end up with. With our vision system, we have something called color constancy. And color constancy, there's really no mechanism for understanding how that works, so I have a theory about that. And the theory basically says our rods, we know that our rods are sensitive to blue. And we also know that we have, I'm going to just go a little bit ahead here. So we also know that we have rods that are sensitive to blue. We also know that this area is a vitreous fluid We know that this is a lens, and quite frankly, if you've ever seen one of these lenses in your hand, they're not great. Zeiss lenses are much, much better, but don't create the kind of images that we see. The vitreous fluid is an index matching fluid, but its real purpose is to keep the eyeball in the shape of an eyeball. It keeps it under pressure so it doesn't collapse on itself. But the vitreous fluid has an interesting property, and that property is that it diffuses blue. So when blue comes into the eye and into the lens and reaches the vitreous fluid, it scatters blue. Think about the fact that it scatters blue, and in our periphery, this area here, these are where the rods are. And the rods are sensitive to blue. Well, if you think about that, maybe what's happening is that the rods are providing the brain with a blue reference. It's telling the brain how much blue there is in this scene. Because when we move from place to place, or if we were opening the door and saw light coming in from outdoors that is much bluer than the light that we're generating here, we would not see anything wrong. But a digital camera or a film camera would see that as very, very wrong color. So we have a color constancy mechanism that is unexplained. But we have a physiology that might explain it. We have cones that are seemingly facing the wrong way. The pointy side is towards the back. And when you think about an antenna would basically want the light to come in as waves, not as photons, but as waves, enter the cone, reflect back as a conical waveguide back into the neural network that is in front of these cones. So you think about the fact that we have 25 or more membrane layers that are real neural networks and real capillaries in order to keep this stuff alive. Think about the fact that the image that you've learned that gets focused onto the red, green, and blue cones of your retina, how would that work if you were going through a vitreous fluid that was diffusing blue, going through a lens that was not a great lens, and going through 25 membrane layers, neural network membrane layers, before it ever reached your cones? What do you think an image like that would look like? Not great. But if it was waves, and our cones were frequency detectors, not photon detectors, but frequency detectors, then all of this physiology makes sense. We've got the vitreous fluid to diffuse blue for color constancy. We've got these membrane layers that do not allow infrared and ultraviolet to get through, because that would destroy the cones, and it would heat the cones. So the membrane layers actually act as a bandpass filter. An interesting thing about our vision system is that blue is 400 nanometers, or 800 terahertz. And red is about 800 nanometers, deep red, and 400 terahertz. The doubling of the frequency of red does not make it blue. It's 1 octave. So nature has designed this antenna system to be only 1 octave. That's very important, because in radio theory, there are such things as harmonics. If you have a sine wave is just one frequency. But if you have a complex wave, odd harmonics are odd multiples, and even harmonics are even multiples. We don't see those artifacts because our system filters, bandpass filters, all the frequencies that would fall out of the visual spectrum, which is only 1 octave. It's a very clever system. So this is what a cone, a pictorial representation of a cone. They don't really look like that. I'm going to move on to 3D. So when you go to a movie and you see a 3D movie, the movie is captured using cameras that have two cameras or 2 lenses, and those lenses are facing straight on. When we see 3D with binocular vision, we don't see 3D because of having our eyes facing straight on. We converge. It's called orthostereoscopic. So our vision system causes a fusion of the 2 separate images from each of our eyes based on the distance that we are seeing. So things that are close up, my eyes are almost crossed. Things that are far away, they're almost parallel, but they're not exactly parallel. We have fusion. It's called convergence. So my point is that when you go to the movies and you look at a 3D movie, what you see is 3D captured in a way that's different from the way we capture 3D with our vision system. So we see those images as layered 3D, as if there were different layers of depth. When we look at 3D with our eyes, doing this convergence mechanism, we see things that are not layered. I see continuous 3D. So there's a mismatch there. No one seems to want to correct that. Why? Because it's a lot harder for every scene to adjust the angles of the cameras so that they converge. We do it automatically with our vision system. So let me move on to audio, because we do the same thing with audio. We screw that up too. When you buy a speaker system, like for your hi-fi, it generally has 3 speakers in it. It has a woofer for low frequencies, a mid-range for mid-frequencies, and a tweeter for high frequencies. And inside that speaker is what's called a crossover network. And that crossover network is a bunch of electronic components that separate the low frequencies, so they only go to the base, the woofer. And the mid-frequencies, they only go to the mid-range. And the high frequencies only go to the tweeter. That way, we're maximizing the amount of energy each of these transducers is able to produce sound. That's the good news. The bad news is the sound is created not from a point source. It's created now from this area that is creating the sound waves. What that does is it messes up our ability to figure out what direction the sound is coming from. Our hearing system is based on not the frequency response of the sound that we receive. It's based on when the sound gets received by our ears. So if you're an engineer making a speaker today, you design the speaker for flat frequency response from 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz, and you're very proud of the fact that you can show a flat curve. If you were to take a frequency response of this room, you would find that the frequency response from 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz is all over the place. In fact, if you were to take a microphone and put it in the middle of this room, all of you would be hearing me just fine, except that when you listen to the recording from that microphone, what you'd hear is air conditioner noise, you'd hear reflections and echoes and all over the place, and you'd hear rumbling, you'd hear people shuffling all over. We filter that out. You don't even know you're doing it. So we're constantly tuning, but we're tuning based on time of arrival of signals. We're not tuning based on making the room sound like it's flat frequency response. So John Watkinson is an engineer in Reading in the UK. His real job is that he designs helicopters for the UK military. But he has written many, many books on digital video and compression systems for video. But his hobby is to make speakers. And the reason we're buddies is because he understands human perception for audio and for video. So we like to think we have commonalities here. He designed a speaker system that focuses the sound into a point and releases the sound, regardless of its frequency, releases the sound from that point. What that means is that every wave, every frequency, reaches your ears at the right moment. And his theory is that's what we're designed to hear. We're not designed to hear flat frequency response. We're designed to hear sounds that's temporally correct, sounds that arrive at the right time. So he built 2 of these, which we bought from at the Naval Research Lab, and we put these speakers. We did a demo in Dusseldorf in Germany in a 600-room audience. We bought a CD off the shelf that was recorded with what's called minimal microphone techniques. It's recorded with 2 microphones. That's the way Riverdance, the CD, was recorded, 2 microphones. You play that with 2 speakers in a 600-seat auditorium. There isn't a bad seat, and you can detect where each of those footsteps in that dance is hitting the stage, as if they were actually there. You play the piano, a recording of a piano with 2 microphones, and you believe that the piano is really there. Pianos are really hard to record. You have a singer, you absolutely believe that that singer is physically there. So what he's done is he's created a system for audio where there is no information missing. And when there is no information missing, we actually believe that it's real. There's a lot of effort going on right now with virtual reality goggles, and the problem with virtual reality in my mind is it's not reality. It is virtual. I'll give them that much. But it's far from reality. You're never fooled into believing that the image you're looking at is just like reality. You're looking at an image that's fooling you, it's entertaining you, or making you fall over because you're losing your balance. So the point is, we should be building systems that are a better match to human perception. Full spectrum color displays and sensing, high dynamic range, matching the real world, matching our ability of our vision system to see very, very wide-ranging light levels. Orthostereoscopic 3D capture and display, temporally based acoustic generation. You would actually be able to create a system that would look real. But you first have to understand that the 215-year-old hypothesis about how we see with red, green, and blue cones that we still teach in school can't possibly work. Joseph Fourier invented well, he didn't invent, it was in his research proposal on heat research. He invented a way of figuring out how heat gets distributed. And basically, the prize jury declined to publish it, criticizing the sloppiness of Fourier's reasoning. Now that was in 1811. in the 1970s, people were still not using Fourier. What is Fourier? Fourier transforms are a method of taking a complex signal and dissecting it into its frequency components. It has become a very valuable way of doing signal analysis. I don't think there's anyone who doesn't use Fourier analysis right now. But over 170 years went by before we treated it seriously. Heart monitoring can be better analyzed using Fourier transforms, and some people are doing this, but many people are not. We have the ability to utilize sensors in ways that we never had the ability to utilize before. I built a little hearing aid as a Kickstarter. Used 10 MEMS mics. MEMS microphones you could not build this hearing aid with 10 microphones 5 years ago. The microphones did not exist. They were all too big. Company came out with MEMS microphones. Why? Because people were making cell phones and needed to make cell phones smaller. And the microphones were really big. So they started making MEMS microphones, which are very, very small microphones that have very, very good frequency response. At the time, I was approached by Princeton University. They were doing micro bioanalysis of trees in a forest. NASA looks at the whole forest. They're looking at the efficacy of a tree in a forest. And they wanted to be able to listen to the trees ultrasonically. Why? Well, when a tree is healthy, it's all wet on the inside, and when it moves by the wind, we don't hear anything. But when the tree starts having decay, we start hearing the tree creaking. We hear that in the audio range between 20 hertz and 20 kilohertz. But birds hear the sounds above 20 kilohertz. So they wanted me to build a microphone for them that was an ultrasonic microphone that would allow them to hear what the birds hear about the tree. Why do they care? Well, birds care that a tree is making more noise ultrasonically because that means there's decaying matter inside there. That means there's bugs. Bugs are a food source. Well, 3 years ago, I could not build this microphone for Princeton because the microphones for ultrasonics were too big. When I was making this hearing aid, I contacted the company. I said, do you make any ultrasonic versions of this MEMS microphone? They said, no. Why? Do you want one? I said, well, yeah, we have applications for it. I didn't tell them that we only wanted one. In any case, they said that it was very, very easy for them to change it to do ultrasonics, and they did. And I'm now buying ultrasonic microphones that cost less than $1. The point is, we now have these sensors. We have accelerometers, we have gyro sensors, we have magnetometers. We have the ability to do things that we could never do before. Most of these sensors are already built into our phones, and our phones have gigahertz processors in them that are multitasking and multi-core. So the analysis that can be done in a way that's so portable, this is low-hanging fruit. We should think out of the box about how to do this monitoring. You know, people buy Fitbits. They buy more Fitbits than they buy iPhones. But the thing is that the Fitbits only monitor certain limited things and don't allow us to leverage that data. Well, how about making a Fitbit that does do Fourier analysis on heart rate, and instead of just capturing beats per minute, to worry about the repetition rate of the heart temporally. So, you know, we have a lot of these opportunities, and because we're not connecting the dots between what we need to improve healthcare and what kind of electronics and sensing technology is out there, and what kind of software do we need, and what kind of platforms they need to run on, and how do we get the data from point A to point B using devices that used to cost $100 and now cost $3. There's now a new chip called an ESP8266 that was made as a secret that you could only buy in China. It was so that the Chinese could make Internet of Things devices that no one else on the planet could make. And it leaked out. And you can now buy these off the shelf from many, many different factories and distributors in the US. They cost less than $3 each. It's a Wi-Fi chip. It allows you to communicate any piece of data over a Wi-Fi network. This used to be not only big, but also expensive. Now it's tiny and inexpensive. We need to be leveraging stuff like that. We need to be thinking out of the box and advertising what it is that you guys need to monitor, to connect the dots to the people who can actually make this stuff and solve your problem. So that you've got all these systems in place to store data, you've got systems in place to analyze the data. This is an opportunity to get more data. We can use stuff to do better monitoring of brain function, better monitoring of breathing. This ultrasonic microphone, you know, I'm not a doctor. I'm not a medical professional. Built the ultrasonic microphone, but I have asthma. I can hear wheezing that cannot be picked up by a microphone because this is ultrasonic wheezing. That might be helpful to somebody. I hear that there's evidence that if you've got bone spurs and joints, that if you were able to couple those joints to a microphone, that you could have you could be able to listen to the fact that those joints are creating friction. In any case, my point is that there's a lot of disconnects. And there have been disconnects through the centuries. You've heard that not only from me, but you've heard that from a lot of other people today. That people come up with ideas, and those ideas go dormant for centuries. And we're at a time now that technology is escalating so very, very quickly. And most of our problem today is that devices that are created today are not meant to last for more than a year or two or three at the most. They're going to be replaced by some other technology, and you're going to either lose or throw away what you have now. It's not like there used to be a telephone with a dial on it, a rotary dial, which, by the way, my students don't even know how to use a rotary dial. It's just amazing. They don't even know it's a telephone. But the telephone was developed, and 50 years went by for them to refine that phone. And they worried about what the audio sounded like. They worried about a side tone. A side tone is that when you're talking, you hear a little bit of yourself coming back. When we got into digital telephones, and you talk, how many times have you say, "Do you hear me?" Because there's no feedback. The Bell system worried about stuff like this because they knew that they were interfacing with humans, and they wanted to make that match as close as possible. We don't do that anymore because we don't spend enough time worrying about it, because the next product's going to come along and obsolete what we just spent all this time and energy and money putting into. When you're doing software development, you know you've got bugs. Okay, why do you have bugs? You might have bugs for a number of reasons. You could have bugs because you have bad programmers. You could have bugs because you didn't have a good specification for your program in the first place. But you could have bugs because of these are things that were unpredictable. Why were they unpredictable? Because when computers first came out, we used to program computers in very, very low-level computer language. So we knew exactly what we were telling the computer to do. As we became more sophisticated, we developed higher level languages. So we now have higher level languages that make it really easy for us to program computers. And then what we do is we put those programs into a compiler, and the compiler breaks down that program into machine code so that the computer actually knows what to do, but we don't know what the computer knows what to do anymore. Because each one of these compilers could be compiling it differently. What that means is there are bugs that are created that were unforeseen. Now you go through a process of fixing those bugs. So in a short period of time, you've clobbered about 50% of the bugs. And in the next period of time, you've clobbered another 10%, and then another 10%, and another 10%. Eventually, you're ending up with about 10% of the bugs that it would take more time and more money to fix than it would be worth it because the next product's going to come out. So you end up with product that really isn't finished, ever. And the way to resolve these things is to come up with devices that do one thing very simply and do it well. You know, I used to work for Disney. I ran R&D at the Disney company. And Disney builds rides, they build attractions that never fail. And they never fail because they don't use PCs or Macs. They use something called a PLC, a programmable logic controller. A programmable logic controller is the same kind of controller that you use to run an elevator, because an elevator cannot fail. It only does one thing, and it will do only that one thing forever. And then what we did was we started building systems that were repurposed from the space shuttle. These are systems that monitored the signature analysis of every signal that was taking place in the space shuttle. We repurposed that to listen to air handlers, air conditioner, air handlers, listen to motors on animatronics figures, look at the position of every part of an animatronics figure for every 30th of a second, which is a SMPTE timecode frame. Look at the power that gets used by a system for every SMPTE timecode frame. If any of those parameters changed, we'd be able to identify what light bulb out of the 100,000 light bulbs in an attraction was bad. We'd be able to know that there's a fan or a bearing in an air handler that's going to go bad maybe 3 months from now. So 4 o'clock in the morning, we had a maintenance person come in and replace the bearing on an air handler that was working perfectly well. But we knew it was going to fail. These are things that we could be doing with humans. Just have to think about how to do them. And then add that information to your database, because you've made really good progress on database and analysis for improving the efficiency of running hospitals and improving our analysis of data so that we can predict when someone's really going to get ill in advance, or predict what medications would work for certain diseases, because everybody's different. So basically, what I'm trying to say is that we need to think out of the box. We need to connect the dots. We need to combine disciplines and connect them together so that when an engineer comes over to you and talks about stuff and you don't understand what that engineer means, that doesn't mean it should be ignored. It means that means you need to put more energy into it in order to be able to improve the communication path, because without improving that communication path, we're going to be still stuck in this rut. So, thank you for coming.
Potentially.
Oh, sure.
And we'll just start on this side of the room and move. Any questions?
Yeah.
Hi. So I'm Michelle, and I'm actually currently working on a project that's evaluating wireless devices that are able to monitor vital sign characteristics as well as other characteristics. And actually, MIT came out last November. They're developing a product that's an ingestible vital sign monitor that uses acoustic waves to track heart rate and respiratory rate. And I guess going off one of your last points, what do you recommend in encouraging facilitation within different departments of universities and different universities in general to get healthcare workers and engineers and statisticians to sort of come together? And it's possible that different departments are working on the same, trying to solve the same problem, but aren't aware that they can work together.
That's a big question. What I've learned is that research labs at universities have their own character and culture, and they're all different. So there isn't one answer about, what university would you go to for something. Each university brings something else to the table. The good news is that the hardware exists to do the kinds of things that, ingestible things. I can tell you that back in the mid-90s, I worked with Michael Hawley at MIT's Media Lab, and he ingested what I thought was the first ingestible camera. That's what he said. He was probably right. But what's remarkable to me is that that was the mid-90s. We're now talking 20 years later, and we're first ingesting microphones wirelessly. The good news is it's wireless. You don't have to wait for it to pass through the system. So you're able to dynamically monitor things. I have a food scientist that I work with at NYU. She did an ingestible where she wanted to see how the difference between how chewed gummy bears and whole gummy bears get digested. So she put a camera in, and at the same time as chewed gummy bears, and I told her it's not good for the gummy bears. But what was remarkable is it took 3 hours for the unchewed gummy bear to get digested. This is probably good information for somebody. The great thing about this, for me, is not about the gummy bears. Sorry, not about the gummy bears. The great thing for me is we're now able to dynamically monitor a pill being ingested in real time. That has a lot of potential. So in my world, I'm an audio video guy, I'm a hardware guy. Just being able to swallow the pill is good. What it needs is the connectivity to people in the healthcare industry to tell us, okay, well, I now know I can swallow a pill and it's got this kind of monitoring. It's got a camera, it's got an audio sensor, maybe it's got an accelerometer, maybe it's going to measure temperature and acidity or whatever. What do you need? That connection is something that we need to fix, because it's not that it's broken, it doesn't exist. So I don't know whether I answered your question, but.
So we got a couple of questions here, and then we'll move around to other tables. So there's a question: how do we balance speed, price, and safety? It appears that your view of technology would be very innovative and much cheaper, but how do we make sure that it's safe regulatory, in terms of regulation?
Well, I was talking about the regulatory stuff before. I think that part of the problem here is that we have a regulatory process that is really very cumbersome and very expensive. And it prevents a lot of these innovative ideas from even being tested. We need to have a code to be able to enter into a system that makes the system believe that this was a valid process that could be used on a human, and that the data coming back from it is usable, whether it's been approved or not. And I think it's up to you guys to decide what may be safe and what's not going to be safe. And of course, that brings up risk assessment and things like that. But the problem that exists right now is, even if I invented something today that might be good for collecting really good data, getting it to be able to legally be used on a human is a real process and very expensive. And quite frankly, it's not as expensive and not as slow in the UK and in Europe. It's generally known that you're going to be $5 to $8 million in 5 to 8 years in the US trying to get approval. And in the European Union, a year, year and a half, less than $1 million. So what are they doing that allows you to apply new technology to humans that we're preventing that from happening? So I think there's got to be some change. There's got to be some mechanism for experimentation that doesn't cost, that there's no price barrier around.
So I'm going to follow up a question of mine. So imagine if you were to allow the data that comes from those experimental things to be shared amongst providers. Would that accelerate adoption and peer review and publication potentially? That analysis being able to be shared.
I think it opens up a whole new world, and then you know, you're collecting data that you could never collect before, and now you've got to evaluate what data is rich and what data is just, you know, you're not ready for prime time yet. I don't know. But I think that the problem right now is that the mechanism doesn't exist for experimentation.
I'm going to go to the next table. Any questions over here?
I enjoyed your talk very much. As general and as mind-bending as it all was, I want to ask about a very specific point, and that is the signal transduction that takes place in the eye after a frequency-tuned cone is activated. So through the years, there was a story about ion channels activated by cyclic nucleotides that were activated after light struck rhodopsin. Is that part of the story still?
I think the protein activation is well known. That if you excite that protein
Right.
with energy, that it's going to respond very quickly. I don't get that far.
Okay.
Where there's other stuff that I didn't mention. Maybe I'll mention. There's a woman by the name of Marion Eckmiller. She might be called Marion Sangler right now. She studies macular degeneration. And what she discovered is that people with certain types of macular degeneration have perfectly normal cones. They're perfectly healthy cones. But there's a little pivot at the bottom of the cone that's like a muscle that tunes the position of the cone. Cones like wave back and forth, and they tune the position of the cone. When that muscle gets calcified, just like arthritis, it can't allow the cone to move, therefore the cone is no longer aligned. What she realized, she read my paper, and what she realized is if the eye was a photon detector, alignment of the cone wouldn't matter. But the fact that the cone does this waving means that it's trying to align to something. When you wake up in the morning, you can't see 100%. But after about 5 minutes, you have better acuity. It's that waving. That waving happens when you awaken. There's also a restoration of the cone itself during that waking time. But that's another story. But here's the point. She came to the US specifically to talk to me about my wave theory, because why would the cones have to wave to align themselves if they were photon detectors? They must be wave detectors. So she knew I was onto something. What she discovered is under tunneling electron microscopy, she had her postdocs look at the base of the cone and determined that there are microtubules, 1,500 microtubules in the base of every cone. And each one of those microtubules has a different length. What she surmised, based on my wave theory, was that the wave was coming into the cone, hitting the pointed end, coming back, which allowed the waves to align themselves so they entered the microtubules. And if you think of the microtubules as tuning forks or pipe organs, that each one would resonate at a different wavelength of light. And they would be connected to this neural network, which would basically be telling the neural network what the color is that you're seeing, or combinations of colors that you're seeing. And these are all treated sinusoidally, so they're basically just one wavelength at a time. So that was her theory. We don't know how it works, okay? What we know is that red, green, and blue cones with photon detection, we'd see noise. We wouldn't see the colors that we see. We wouldn't have the dynamic range that we have. But I did mathematical computer modeling at the University of Delaware, where we mathematically modeled a cone, the size of a cone, as an antenna. And it worked perfectly from 400 terahertz to 800 terahertz, which is red to blue. And more importantly, it had a 55-degree acceptance angle. That happens to be the acceptance angle of our vision system, plus and minus 55 degrees, 110 degrees. Also determined that it would have a 70 dB dynamic range, which happens to be what we have. I don't take any of this stuff seriously. I just, collect the data because I'm not a biologist. I was asked by the Royal Society to write a paper on this. I did write the paper. I had it peer-reviewed, but I didn't have it published because I can't defend the biology. I'm an electronics engineer. So, but there's lots of things like this that just bother me. For instance, you go to an audiologist, and an audiologist puts headphones on you and subjects you to various tones, sinusoidal tones at different levels, and determines this is this curve that you hear, and then might prescribe a hearing aid that has that curve or a complementary curve. The fact of the matter is, very little of what we hear on a daily basis are sine waves. We hear complex waves. Complex waves have harmonics, which means that those frequencies are multiples of the fundamental sine wave frequencies. So the information that we're collecting from, the audiologist collects is really not a great match for the way we hear. But we're still doing this today. That's how we design hearing aids. So we've got these disconnects that basically don't follow what we know. And those are the kinds of things that drive me crazy.
I'm going to go on to the next table. Any questions over here? No? Walk around. I think we're near it. Oh, we got one over here. Okay.
Thanks for a really nice talk. When will my digital camera use wave detectors instead of photodiodes?
Could you repeat that?
When will my digital camera use wave detectors instead of photodiodes?
Well, I actually have a patent on that.
I was wondering, actually.
I also have a patent on if you could do that, have a wave detecting camera, which I know how to do. If you could do that, you could actually create a camera that doesn't have a lens, that all the lens functions are basically handled by software in the inverse Fourier transform, still Fourier transform.
I think we got one or two more questions. I think Glenn's going to tell us about tomorrow. Is there any other last-minute questions? No? Okay. Great. Thank you.
You're welcome.